Okay, welcome everybody to our next talk, which is called Ethics in a Data Society. And our next speaker here, Maya Ganesh, she is the Director of Applied Research at Tactical Tech Collective, you might know it as. She calls herself a research practitioner, writer, and activist. And she has a master's degree in media and culture studies, but also in applied technology, with psychology, which is an interesting mix, I think. And her issues, or the issues she's working on, is technology and activism, human rights defense, with a focus on gender and technology. But today, because Maya is also a doctoral candidate at Leuphana University, which is not far away from here, at Lüneburg University, she has her doctoral project, a project on ethics in the context of driverless cars, which is the topic of her talk today. And in her lecture, Maya will discuss her ongoing research on the emergence of this new technology and how it shapes our understanding and the meaning of ethics in a data society. Give a warm welcome to Maya and enjoy the talk.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And thank you very much to 33C3 for giving me this opportunity to talk about my work. I've actually talked about this topic a couple of times this past year. However, this is a brand new talk because everything is recorded these days, so you can't recycle a talk. However, it's weird to actually feel slightly nervous, even though it's something that you know very well. And, like they say, nobody knows your PhD topic like you do. Maybe that's because of all of the numbers of really wonderful people who I know and love and respect in the audience. Maybe a little bit of nervousness coming from there. It's always hard to talk to people who you think are smarter than you. Anyway, so that's why it's a nice way to kind of title my talk also. I changed the title, Entanglements. It's not Ethics in the Data Society. I just did that so that 33C3 would accept the talk. This was always supposed to be the title. When I started thinking about ethics, I actually started in a very different place. I wasn't really that interested in driverless cars. I was interested in this thing that I discovered called an ethical app, which is actually a shopping app about making the right kinds of consumer choices. And it struck me as very odd that people thought that ethics could come out of an app. And I'm actually not I'm not really into ethics. If I can get through the next 4 years without reading Aristotle, I'd be really happy. But I was curious about what it is about technology that makes people feel like it will give us answers to these really complex social and political situations, problems that we face. And that's where I come from in trying to sort of understand the workings of society and technology. So when we are talking about ethics, what are we really talking about? That's the first thing I kind of had to engage with, that we're actually having a discussion about a technology that's emerging in society, and driverless cars are kind of at the peak of what Gartner calls the hype cycle. So every day there's a story about driverless cars. A lot of this technology, which I believe is not very robust, not very well tested, is actually being developed in the open. So it's very difficult for the public to also develop a sense of confidence in what this technology means. And things like cars are so banal and so mundane, but they are very intimate machines, and we have a long history of relating to them. So when we talk about ethics, what are we really talking about? And I'll go through some of these things in the course of my talk today. I will also skip over some things in the interest of time, but I think that there's space for questions as well at the end. So at one level, we're talking about things that can be programmed into software, moral decisions that will result in certain outcomes that we term as ethics. When we say ethics and driverless cars, or ethics and autonomous technologies more broadly, we're also thinking about who's responsible when something goes wrong, but also who is going to pay when something goes wrong. And I think the financialization of risk and the rise of the insurance industry is something I'm personally quite interested in, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But the most interesting thing that I think I discovered in the course of doing this work is my own interest in science fiction and how we relate to machines. And I think that a lot of our understanding around new technologies today has to do with the fact that, we grew up watching things like Star Wars, or we watched Ex Machina, or, it's cinema and literature and fantasy are such a big part of our relationship with the technologies that we create and technologies that we inhabit. So I'm also going to, well, I'm not going to talk about that so much in this talk, but maybe in some other. So we're seeing the combination of all of these multiple conversations going on at the same time. And I'll start by talking about ethics as something that we think can be programmed. And there's some really interesting new projects that kind of think that, ethics can be an outcome of a software program. I usually start by talking about this thing called the trolley problem, which has become very popular recently thanks to Google's self-driving car project. Google recently renamed its self-driving project, self-driving car project Waymo. And they popularized this thing called the trolley problem, which comes from the 1960s and a philosopher called Philippa Foot, who actually came up with the trolley problem in order to think through the permissibility of abortion. And so I usually kind of give this big description of what the trolley problem is. It is kind of jargon heavy. But a good thing is that a team out of MIT developed something called the Moral Machine Project, which is based on this, classical thought experiment called the Trolley Project. So I'll talk about the Moral Machines project, the ethics bots, and the application of another quite old 400-year-old problem called the Pascalian Wager. I will try not to make this, I will try to make this funny and not too complicated. I mean, even I don't get it sometimes. So moral machines. So you can look at this, moralmachine.mit.edu. It's based on the trolley problem, like I said, and the idea in the trolley problem is a car is going down, a train trolley is going down a track. The brakes fail, and so the trolley is not going to stop, but there is a fork in the track, and the trolley has a lever. So you can either make the trolley go left, or you can make the trolley go right. Now, the thing is, on the left, there are 5 people working on the track, and on the right, there's 1 person. So the decision you have to make is it better to kill 5 people or better to kill 1 person? This is absolutely impossible to resolve, but this is what the trolley problem does. So you have to decide who you're going to kill, but you also have to come up with the rationale for how you're going to kill them. So this is sort of this classic tension between utilitarian ethics and Kantian deontological ethics, which simply means the outcome matters. Does the outcome matter? Or does how the rationale for why you want to kill either 1 or 5 matter? And again, this is impossible. It's really difficult to do. But the Moral Machine Project does this. So they set up a scenario, and these are just like screen grabs from the website, which you can look at. So a car is going down, the brakes fail, and the people crossing are, in this scenario, there's a thief, there's an old lady, there's a baby in a pram, there's a cat, and you have to decide who is going to be saved. There are little skull and crossbone signs to say who will be killed and who will not be killed in this scenario. There are others as well. In this one, it's like 5 dogs versus 5 cats. And this is another scenario. So this is part of a research project that these scholars at MIT are doing. So you browse through 13 scenarios and you decide who you're going to sacrifice in this hypothetical test. And then you can go on to fill in details, if you so wish, about who you are and your opinions, why you made certain choices. This is all in the interest of research. You can also choose not to give your data to MIT. And I did the test. I've actually done it a number of times. And I have to say, a couple of times I just kind of randomly, I just kind of hit any option. So, the test taker wanted to know, why did I prefer, younger people to older people, or thieves to, athletes? And this is how you kind of develop this moral scenario where you have to decide who's more important. And the idea is the driverless car software has to make this choice, which, even the best of us cannot make a choice. I found this quote 2 days ago from one of the French philosophers who's behind this project. And he's actually it's interesting that he would say this, that at this point we are looking into various forms of shaded control, which means that any accident is going to have a complicated story about the exact sequence of decisions. So it's not easy to program these things. Even in this age of machine learning, I don't think it's entirely easy to program these things, and I think the developer of the test thinks so too. So the trolley problem kind of pits consequentialist with deontological ethics. Really, really difficult to resolve why and how you should kill X or Y people. So other scholars have thought about other approaches where you have different choices you can make, of these terrible choices you have to make. You make a list of them, and you assign numerical values to the outcomes. And then a computer program will parse those outcomes and decide quite randomly which one to choose. And this, I've kind of said, does God exist? Because the Pascalian Wager that this is based on actually comes from an idea in the 1600s about the existence of God. And it's actually kind of interesting because it's about how would you feel if you discovered that God did or did not exist? There are feelings you would have about them. So the Pascalian Wager is a way to rank numerically these different outcomes. So Vikram Bhargava thinks that you could apply the Pascalian approach to, these terrible outcomes in the case of a car accident. And then we have ethics bots, which is a newer idea by the Etzionis. They looked at users of Nest, the house, the thermostat heat regulation system in a home. And they said, you could develop AI-assisted ethics. So you could have a meta bot to rule the algorithms. This meta bot this ethics bot, would identify patterns in an individual user's Nest use. The assumption is, if you're somebody who cares about the environment, you are more ethical, and you will not use so much heat in your home. You will be very conscious about the regulation of temperature in your home, and you will try to use less energy. This is seen as an assumption of what ethics is, which I actually just kind of started laughing out loud when I saw this, not only because of like a bot having to now oversee algorithms, which is kind of crazy, but that they say, we want this to be personalized. We want individuals to have control and individual moral decision-making to sort of come into this framework. But what if you're actually somebody who, you may sort of regulate the heat in your home, but you may take like 100 flights a year, or maybe you're a menopausal woman who actually just wants to regulate the heat in your house because you can't deal with the hot flashes. It may have nothing to do with how you actually feel about the environment. But the Etzionis think that ethics bots could be a way to kind of evolve moral decision-making, or kind of find a way for machines to learn about moral decision-making. Now, why all of these are kind of interesting and out of a set is because we believe that ethics is an outcome. We believe that ethics can be something that software can be programmed to do, can learn. And I like kind of always trying to introduce Donna Haraway in any of my talks because I think she's really amazing. And I have kind of some of my work kind of tries to look at what does it mean when we think that these wonderful machines that we've created will have the answers for us. And James Bridle today talked a little bit about things like machine vision and computer vision. What happens when we start creating systems and environments for machines to inhabit, and for machines to understand, and for machines to parse. So I kind of asked myself that it's not so much about ethics alone. I mean, ethics are important for sure, but what ethics are is sort of complicated at this point. But what does a city become when it's made for a driverless car? And I came across this video, which is by a design company called Big. The name of the video is "Driverless is More."
Memory, the fade out. Memory, the slipping away.
So of course, it's sort of interesting that there are no humans in any of these scenarios of the future with driverless cars. And there's this quote that I also really like from a paper called Crapularity Hermeneutics by Florian Kramer, where he thinks about what happens if we actually start building systems for machines to inhabit. Yeah, I mean, if you can read the paper, please do, it's great. But then this particular quote is about trying to imagine what the city looks like when it's made for cars. And this is not actually such a distant possibility, because if you talk to people who are involved in regulation and industry and government, this is, I mean, driverless cars, no matter what Gizmodo tells you, are not going to just kind of show up on the street. There's actually like a long process, long, painful process of technology actually being integrated into society. And you have to have a lot of law and regulation as kind of part of that. And it's really interesting that way to look at the history of electricity, which is electricity and telephones, and how it completely disrupted society. And I think that driverless cars are kind of are going to do similar kinds of things, maybe not so visibly at first, but I think it's going to kind of reshape a lot of our social relations. I mean, you have to think about, you know, old people or 7-year-old children who now have kind of independent lives and mobility as well. And I think the sort of update on Turing's old question is not, you know, what do we think of machines that think, but what do we think about machines that can learn? And what we know about machines that learn right now is that they don't learn very well. They learn like toddlers. And this is, I mean, we've seen that, you know, machines basically running machine learning algorithms will replay a lot of the biases that are embedded in original data sets that they're learning from and that they're based on. And another great Donna Haraway quote is that she refers to AI and primates and children as almost minds, to kind of refer to this way in which that they learn. So I think we're still very much in the sort of early stages, but there's a lot riding on the fact that someday the software is going to do kind of amazing things. But before we get there, sort of the other register in which we talk about ethics is also about who's going to pay for it and who's accountable to it. And I think that the history of crash testing, the car industry and crash testing, and the concurrent rise of the insurance industry is also really pertinent, because I think that some of these shifts are happening right now, and I'm personally hoping to look at more of this in the coming year. So in the 1920s and 30s, like, a lot of car crashes happened. But people didn't always know why. And so car manufacturers would spend a lot of effort kind of building cars just to crash them. And the insurance industry kind of grew along with this and was able to learn how to understand how crashes happened. Now, this also allowed science and technology to develop, because people understood a lot more about like physics and the materials that they were using. And so this was, of course, very expensive. But in the 1990s, you saw car manufacturers using modeling and simulations to actually feed in a lot of different variables about crash scenarios and to understand how crashes were actually going to happen. So scholars have actually written about this idea of road to lab to math. And so one of them, Nigel Gale, says that road to lab to math is basically the idea that you want to be as advanced on the evolutionary scale of engineering as possible. Math is the next logical step in the process over testing on the road and in the lab. Math is much more cost effective because you don't have to build pre-production vehicles and then waste them. We've got to get in front of the technology so it doesn't leave us behind. We have to live and breathe math. When we do that, we can pass the savings on to the consumer. So you know what's kind of already in the works and already being developed. And so I'm sort of like quickly moving on to the next part of what I think about how we think about ethics. So what are we really talking about when we're talking about ethics? There is a lot of interest in how technology is made now. People are kind of looking at the man behind the curtain. It is usually a man behind the curtain who's actually making the magic happen. So where is the stuff being designed, and what are the sort of politics of technology design? On the one hand, of course, you have things like Dieselgate, which there have been some talks here as well about Dieselgate, which are really interesting. Volkswagen's very blatant cheating on their emissions using the defeat device, and telling us about, you know, the fact that, you know, corruption happens in business. Now, you've got that scenario, but you've also got a lot of other scenarios just around the development of technology itself. And There are lots of good examples of how technologies that we experience today, especially around social media and consumer devices, betray the biases of their designers. But I was really interested to learn just last week that the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers, IEEE, came out with a really good document around ethically aligned design. It's a 138-page document. I'm only on page 36. So if I'd read more, I would tell you a lot more about it, but it just came out on Monday. But what is interesting to kind of note in this is that there's something much more serious going on, where there is, I think, a discussion about looking at the fact that we cannot embed values in software. It is really hard to align human ethics with machine programming. And I think this is the first time I've actually seen a document that is so global in its scale and its scope, in the way that it's talking to many different kinds of people, including people that, you know, some of us in this room know, like people like Niels from Article 19. I mean, it's interesting that they're actually trying to look at human rights issues in sort of what they're calling ethically aligned design. So I think that there is going to be a lot more interest in looking at the context of production as well. And so we've got this idea that ethics is something that is an outcome, that software will tell us the answer of what is the right thing to do. We've got the idea that maybe ethics is something that we have to think about in terms of from the point of production and who's actually making these things and what are their intentions in producing these things. Or maybe ethics is reduced to a question of the law and insurance. But when I kind of try to think about it for myself, like really honestly, what's going to happen and what's this sort of, you know, great future? I'm not a futurologist at all, but if you do have to have some sense of how this is going to pan out based on what you're already seeing, I think that we're kind of moving towards this place where we have to think about a different relationship with some of these machines that we're making and we're going to have to be using soon. And we already have levels of autonomy in cars, like cruise control and, you know, parking. And the history of cars and, you know, sort of driving will tell you that, and crashes tells you that machines are very, very accurate and they are fantastic at performing certain computational tasks, but they're really crap at doing a lot of things that humans are very good at. In the testing of Google's self-driving cars, Google cars were constantly being rear-ended or getting into accidents because they were programmed to follow the rules. But as anybody who kind of drives a car, or if you're a taxi driver in Berlin, perhaps maybe not a regular German driver, because I think German drivers really follow the rules. But where I come from, I mean, like, you know, if it's an open road, if it's late at night, you're going to speed. You're going to, you know, bend the rules a little bit. And actually, it seems like human beings do this. And human beings also do bully robots. They do bully cars. So it's actually kind of like bizarre that companies like Volvo would be concerned about, you know, humans bullying their poor little autonomous vehicles. And the history and the story behind the Tesla car crash, which happened in May, is about autopilot and how this idea of autopilot, anybody who goes up in a plane, is that, oh, you know, the plane just drives itself under autopilot. But it's quite different with driverless cars, because what happened was the test driver was supposedly watching a Harry Potter DVD and put the Tesla into autopilot mode. And the car could not distinguish between the sky, it was a bright day, the bright white sky, and the white side of this, one of those big long trailer trucks. It just couldn't tell, which tells you something about the computer vision in Mobileye, which is in Tesla. But anyway, so the car went into the big trailer truck because it thought it was just the sky. And so that kind of made, you know, sort of brought this idea of autopilot on out in a big way. And Tesla's kind of going to a lot of pains to say that, you know, autopilot does not mean your hands are off the wheel. The human has to be in the loop constantly. Even the German government recently just told Tesla that if they were, when they bring their cars into this country, they have to change the word. They cannot use the word autopilot because it is too misleading. But I think this kind of thinking about autopilot and what is the kind of relationship or the sort of handshake that we have with machines is something that's going to have to be explored more and more. It's not just about regulation and lanes and zoning for the car to actually be on the road, but maybe other kinds of licensing, maybe other kinds of personal insurance as well, if you have to actually inhabit a space with machines like this quite closely. So I was actually, well, maybe I have time to talk about the ethical fan, which is sort of sideways, but it's this kind of speculative project by these two Shanghai-based French artists, and it's trying to kind of like, poke fun at the idea that the machine will have the idea, but it's also about design, and can you design ethics into machines? So they have this little, just a fan, and you can have settings on the fan of people. So two people come and sit in front of the fan, and the fan has to make a decision about which way it will turn and who it will fan. So you can put in values about the people that, so-and-so is a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist, so-and-so has this kind of education, this is how tall they are, how fat they are, how thin they are. And then these variables are sent to mechanical Turk workers in Dubai or Cape Town or Washington, D.C. And then these humans make a decision about which way the fan could turn, not being in that context at all or seeing anything about those people. But this is, I would like to think that we have this moment of, loving grace with machines where we work together really smoothly. But I think before that happens, there's actually going to be a lot of like really rubbish things like this where, mechanical Turkers halfway around the world will make a decision about what a machine should do. And so I'm kind of coming to the end of this, and I'm thinking about other sorts of approaches to ethics as well, that it's not something that software can tell you the answer to. It's not something that insurance or even just kind of, car manufacturers will come up with, but that ethics gets produced contextually in different situations through a number of different actors and factors that are human and non-human. And Mike Anani has this great quote about it, and I love the fact that he calls it, it is not a test to be passed or a culture to be interrogated, but a complex social and cultural achievement, which is kind of music to like, a science and technology studies scholar like myself, but it's just like, it's really difficult if you have to think about how does this happen practically? And so I'm kind of interested in seeing, can you actually use design fiction as a methodology to get people to think through how this will happen? So I recently had an opportunity to work with some programmers and designers, working with a company that I'll call Berliner Tech. They said that I had to sign an NDA after the workshop, but the paperwork was a bit slow and they forgot to give me the NDA to sign. So I could tell you who they are, but I don't want to because they're really nice people and I shouldn't tell you who they are. So I got to work with this group of people and put them through a series of exercises. And they work on building technology for autonomous vehicles, or kind of. So this is very much in their world, and I didn't realize, but these are questions they have to think about every day, that what if you had to build a map layer for parents and children to share information about children's independent journeys in driverless cars? Or the second situation, which is actually kind of happening, that what if a route finding app wants to avoid high crime neighborhoods, but the databases for high crime neighborhoods are already so racially loaded and come from such sort of suspect sources that the car is going to maneuver itself away from, we know what high crime neighborhoods are. I'm still in the process of actually writing up the notes and thinking about what they talked about. But what I can say is that I was so struck by how thoughtful people were. And these are all programmers who work in big technology companies or kind of allied with car companies. And people want to find ways to be political about these things. Engineers and technologists and scientists want to find ways to actually say, no, this is terrible. I see what the implications are of what I'm doing, and I want to find a way to push back, but I am part of a much bigger corporate machine. At the end of the day, I'm paid money to build this technology. So I think that it's, I would like to do much more of these kinds of workshops and using design fiction as an idea and as a methodology and process, excuse me. And I'm going to end there because I'm out of time and I really need to drink some water. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Maya. So now take your time to drink something. We have time for, I think, 1 or 2 questions. Okay, perfect. And we also have a signal angel in the room. Who is it? Please raise your hand. No one's here. Okay. Yeah, please, first question.
Okay, so my question is a bit general, but when it comes to responsibility in developing systems that are very critical on ethics, for example, crime rating algorithms that rate convicted people and stuff like that. We have messed up a lot there. This is just one instance, but just assume some ethically relevant program or algorithm. Anybody that is involved in developing that algorithm or developing the technology has some stake in responsibility. What would be your answer to explain this kind of responsibility and how to unentangle all the responsibility that goes into this process?
Short answer is I don't know, but I think that, and I don't think anybody knows. I mean, anybody who kind of works on these kinds of projects or any kind of projects knows that there's millions of lines of code in these things. There's millions of, discussions about how a project should evolve. I mean, like I've been reading a lot about like the history of terrible incidents and crashes like the Challenger space shuttle crash in 1986. And that was something that happened in one of the best resourced NASA at a time when there was a lot of money given to the space race. That crash happened because of bureaucracy and tensions between bureaucrats and scientists about the O-rings on the side of the space shuttle, which they knew would break under certain climatic conditions. So there's a whole book just called about this thing called the normalization of deviance, that basically, it's very hard to identify who's responsible, but you have to find a way to do it. And you can't say that, oh, this one programmer did this thing. So that's why this idea that technology ethics have to be thought of as something that are kind of produced contextually, and you have to actually start kind of laying out and maybe weighting and rating. So in a way, this kind of modeling approach is inevitable at one level. So I think that people have to just try something else aside from just saying, oh, ethics is an answer. It's kill this person or that person. It's not ethics, if you think of it as a framework for living well and dying well, it's not about killing well, which is actually what you see with drone warfare. And there's a term for this, necroethics. Gregoire Chamaillou talks about this, that it's really complex. I don't know the answer, but I think we should try to figure it out.
Yeah, very good. We have time for one last question. I'm sorry, but you were first.
But we can talk after.
If that's me, then yeah. So my question is, I believe that this might be the first time that we are forced to agree on a common, set of ethics. I think that is one of the big topics that somehow the car manufacturers are trying to avoid, because that would mean that they decide the set of ethics that everybody has to subscribe to, because we are going to forge this into software and copy it all over the place. Is that studied as well? Or, I mean, I did not see this mentioned in your talk.
That's kind of a problem. I think that actually car manufacturers, and I know one of them, I've had some interactions with one of them. They will be very cagey and they will tell you about the trolley problem again, that ethics comes down to how to program the software to act in the case of an accident, because I don't think they know. And I think we've had in the last 50, 60 years, like incredible movements and scholarship saying that these kind of very heteropatriarchal notions of ethics, that it's about logic and rationality, these come from a certain kind of place. Why are we reproducing and replaying these things? There are incredible kinds of technology ethics, anticipatory ethics, computer ethics, robot ethics that are all being developed as well. So it's very curious that they go back and pick up this very kind of antiquated idea of ethics. I think this is what they believe, and I have a feeling that's what they're going to actually test and program, but they are also nervous. I mean, I read some of the business news and they're kind of cagey about it. I mean, my understanding is that they're cagey about it, but I have a feeling they're going to do something like this anyway. Because the other way is too hard. If you actually try to be more contextual and process-oriented. I don't know, I'd love to actually work with the computer scientist or programmer and actually try to develop a program to say, could you actually map, just for speculation's sake, all of the different actors and points at which you would see responsibility and accountability. I don't know. Thanks.
Yes, thanks again, Maya. The machines just told us to stop. I'm sorry. Thanks again, Maya, and let's give her a warm round of applause. And thanks for this last talk here today.